Everything started on a tense evening when I was standing in the hotel ballroom wearing the nicest dress I could find, ready to attend my son's wedding. The wedding was an event the whole family had been eagerly anticipating, and I too was excited, though a bit nervous. My son Michael was about to marry Jessica Parker, a girl I hadn't fully understood yet. In fact, there were a few signs I should have noticed sooner, but when you're a mother, and when your son finds happiness in love, you tend to overlook small worries. Jessica was the woman Michael loved, and I wanted to support his decision. But things were never as simple as that, especially when you're dealing with a daughter-in-law with a strong personality and an always smug attitude. I remember family gatherings where Jessica wouldn't stop boasting about her work. She worked for Thompson & Associates, a mid-level marketing company in the city centre. She was an important account manager and always made everyone feel small whenever she brought up the company. Every time we had a family dinner, she wouldn't hesitate to take business calls right at the dinner table. "Sorry," she would say, but there was no guilt in her voice. When you're climbing the career ladder, you can't afford to miss any opportunities. And while I tried to be understanding, it still made me uncomfortable. My job, though not as glamorous as hers, had its own value, and I had spent 30 years building relationships in my industry. But I kept this to myself. I understood Michael loved Jessica, and I wanted to support him, even if it wasn't easy. Michael and Jessica's wedding was a big event, and, as usual, Jessica took control of everything. She wanted everything to be perfect, and of course, perfect in her eyes meant everything had to meet her standards. Everything, from the wedding flowers, the music, the guest list, to my role in the ceremony, had to be carefully reviewed. And one of the things that truly bothered me was the way she asserted her role in the family. I remember one time she told Michael, and I overheard it clearly, "I think Dorothy should keep a modest role in this ceremony." She continued, "She doesn't understand how to build professional relationships." Those words, though not said directly to me, felt like a slap in the face. The truth is, I had built professional relationships for over 30 years, and I was proud of that. But I stayed silent, only because I didn't want to ruin my son's joy. The wedding day arrived, and of course, I did my best to stay positive. Michael looked at me with a happy smile as he stood beside Jessica. They were a perfect couple in everyone's eyes. However, behind the smiles and the glamour of the ceremony, something felt off. I couldn't stop noticing Jessica's arrogance and how she looked at me with disdain every time. Then a moment happened that changed everything. During the reception, as we were talking to guests, Jessica led me to meet Mr. Thompson, her boss, a skinny middle-aged man who was very health-conscious. She introduced me to him with a sweet smile, but I could feel the tension in her every gesture. "Mr. Thompson," Jessica said sweetly, "I'd like to introduce you to my mother-in-law, Dorothy. She's currently between jobs." The phrase, "currently between jobs," hung in the air like smoke, but that wasn't what truly made me angry. What really pissed me off was what she said next. Actually, she's been unemployed for quite some time. A real loser. She smiled brightly, and her words felt like a sharp knife stabbing into me. I stood there, frozen, feeling like the whole world around me was crashing down. Though I tried to stay calm, I couldn't stop feeling insulted. That was the moment I realized something important. Jessica wasn't just disrespecting me, she was trying to make me out to be a loser in front of everyone. She thought doing this would make her shine brighter. But what she didn't know was that I was watching her, remembering every detail, every little action, every word she used to put me down. And what she didn't know was that I wasn't someone who could be easily crushed. What she didn't know was that I had a strategy in mind. A strategy not to deal with her immediately, but to wait for the right moment. Once I had my plan, I wouldn't just restore my dignity, I would teach her a lesson she would never forget. As I stood there, in the ballroom lit by sparkling lights and filled with laughter, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. Jessica had just finished her performance, and while I was still smiling, I had made a decision deep inside. She thought I was just an older woman, unemployed and unremarkable, but she was wrong. I wasn't someone easily defeated, and I wouldn't let her continue insulting me. After the meeting with Mr. Thompson ended, I had time to reflect on everything that had happened. I began to realize that this wasn't just about me and Jessica, but also about self-respect and power dynamics within the family. I couldn't let my son see me become a victim of a wife he thought was perfect. And the most important thing was, I couldn't let Jessica think she could humiliate me without facing consequences. So, when the wedding ended and everyone started leaving, I stepped away from the party and found a quiet spot outside to think some more. What should I do next? I wasn't going to react immediately, but I was going to act strategically. I had observed Jessica long enough to realize something important. She was too smug about her success at work, but didn't know that no one was perfect, not even her. In the following days, I didn't rush into action, but sat down and calmly considered everything. But I also began planning. I knew I couldn't let Jessica continue thinking she could control everything. I needed to respond with class and professionalism, because that was my strength. And to do that, I needed to learn more about Jessica, what she was doing at work, and the mistakes she had made. I couldn't let her escape responsibility just because of her arrogant words and self-important attitude. The day after, I contacted Patricia, my longtime assistant. Patricia knew that I never did anything without thorough preparation. I asked her to help me gather information about Jessica, about what she was doing at her company, from spending reports to work records, even information from her social media. Patricia, who had worked with me for 12 years, knew exactly what I was looking for, and she got to work immediately. In the next few days, I received all the information I needed. What I discovered surprised me, but wasn't entirely unexpected. Jessica wasn't the person she had portrayed herself to be. Her expense reports were filled with questionable entries, unclear details. She had inflated her position at the company and even used business trips for personal matters. This wasn't just carelessness, it was an unacceptable behavior for someone in such a high position at a company. But the most important thing I found was something she never thought I would know. Jessica had a very polished LinkedIn profile, but the way she described herself was completely false. She called herself a senior manager, an important decision-maker at the company. The truth, however, was that she was just an account manager, a position nowhere near as impressive as she had claimed. I sat down with all the documents spread out before me and thought about the next step. I didn't just want to get back at Jessica. I wanted her to realize that her actions couldn't go without consequences. I wanted to teach her a lesson in humility and respect for those around her, no matter how successful she thought she was. That's why I decided to contact Mr. Thompson, and I knew when the meeting took place, everything would change. The Monday after the wedding, I was fully prepared. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the documents and expense reports to Jessica's personal information. I was ready to expose all her lies, but I didn't want to do it loudly or hastily. I wanted the meeting with Mr. Thompson to be careful and formal, and most importantly, I wanted Jessica to face the consequences of her own actions. Finally, the day I had been waiting for arrived. On Thursday, with a light drizzle falling from the sky, the gloomy weather seemed to heighten the tension within me. I woke up earlier than usual, carefully preparing my outfit, as if I were a general choosing weapons for an important battle. The navy blue blazer I wore today was something I had used in major meetings throughout my career. It was the outfit that made me feel the strongest and most confident, and today, I needed all that confidence. As I walked into the Thompson & Associates building, the atmosphere inside was completely different from what I had imagined. Everything was sleek and modern, with glass and chrome, motivational posters about creativity and strategic vision, but the feeling of walking into an important meeting made it seem as though I was stepping into a battlefield. The receptionist, a young man with neatly styled hair and a bright smile, greeted me with respect that I hadn't expected. He even offered me water or coffee, but I just asked for a black coffee. I wanted everything to be serious. As I sat in the waiting room, I could see Jessica from a distance. She was sitting at her desk, typing hurriedly on her computer, wearing a red suit and her hair perfectly styled. Jessica was presenting herself as a professional, and I could see her smugness in the image she had built for herself, but I knew she didn't realize I was here to tear down everything she had built. Around 2 p.m., Mr. Thompson entered the waiting room with 2 executives I hadn't met before. Everything moved slowly, and as I stood up, I saw Jessica suddenly stop, her face shifting from confusion to realization and then panic. "Ms. Walsh," Mr. Thompson smiled, his voice polite. "Thank you for coming. I have to say, when your assistant called, we were all excited about the possibility of collaborating with Walsh Enterprises." Jessica stood frozen, her eyes wide, and her face started turning pale. "This excitement, I believe, is based on some misunderstanding," I began, my voice cold but still polite. "This is Jessica Walsh, your account manager, and also my son's wife, and I am Dorothy Walsh, CEO of Walsh Enterprises." The room fell silent, with curious glances exchanged between the executives, unsure of what was happening. "What did you say?" Mr. Thompson began, sounding confused, trying to process everything that just occurred. "She is my mother-in-law," I continued, emphasizing each word calmly. "And the Walsh Enterprises she's referring to is not a trivial company. We've been working together for over 15 years, and now we're facing an important decision. Your company is trying to secure a $12 million contract from us, correct?" Mr. Thompson started to look flustered. $12 million, he muttered, and I could immediately see the shift in his attitude. This story was no longer as simple as he had imagined. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "Before we begin discussing this contract, I think you need to take a closer look at one of your employees," I said, and immediately spread the documents across the table, making the atmosphere in the room even more tense. Jessica turned pale. Her lips began to tremble. What is this?" she asked, her voice confused and panicked. I didn't rush to answer, just slowly flipping through the documents, pointing at the questionable expenses in her reports, the photos from Instagram, showing her using business trips for personal vacations. These documents were irrefutable evidence. "This is your file," I continued. "You inflated your title on LinkedIn and even misrepresented the purpose of your business trips. But I think this is even more serious. These expenses are not just poor financial management, they are unethical practices in the workplace." Jessica was now speechless. She could only stare at the documents laid out before her, unable to offer any justification. "I think," I said gently, "it's time we reconsider the relationship between your company and Walsh Enterprises, because we cannot do business with companies that have such low ethical standards." Suddenly, the female executive sitting next to Mr. Thompson spoke up, her face filled with doubt. "Are you saying we won't have the opportunity to collaborate with Walsh Enterprises if Jessica is still here?" I just smiled, continuing to clarify. "She cannot work for a company like ours if she doesn't respect professional ethics." The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze, but I didn't feel weak. I had done what I set out to do. Jessica had lost her opportunity, and I had made her pay for her actions. With a smart move, I stood up, packed my documents, and smiled at them one last time. "Let me think it over, and I will contact you later," I said before leaving the room. As I stepped out of the building, I couldn't help but feel that I had completed my mission. And as for Jessica, even if she found a new job, the lesson she had just learned would be one she would never forget. As I sat there, waiting for the meeting to begin, the silence in the waiting room seemed to stretch on. The receptionist's nervous energy only added to my growing anticipation. I could see Jessica from my seat, sitting at her desk, typing away furiously on her computer. She was dressed in a sharp red blazer, her hair perfectly styled, the image of professional confidence. but I knew better than to be fooled by appearances. Jessica had built a facade, and today I was here to tear it down. At precisely 2 p.m., Mr. Thompson arrived with 2 other executives I didn't recognize. When they entered the room, Jessica froze. Her face shifted from confusion to recognition, then to something I could only describe as panic. "Mrs. Walsh," Mr. Thompson said with a warm smile, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Thank you so much for coming in. I must say, when your assistant called, we were all very excited about the possibility of working with Walsh Enterprises." Jessica was staring at me, wide-eyed, unable to mask her shock. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," I began calmly, my tone polite but firm. "This is Jessica Walsh, your account manager, and my son's wife, and I'm Dorothy Walsh, CEO of Walsh Enterprises." The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Mr. Thompson looked between Jessica and me, clearly trying to process the information. "You're Jessica's mother-in-law?" he asked slowly. "And you're the CEO of Walsh Enterprises?" I could see the confusion written across his face, and I knew he was trying to figure out how this all connected. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm the CEO of Walsh Enterprises, the same company your team has been working to secure a partnership with for the last 18 months. And I must say, the $12 million contract you've been hoping to land from us is something that's currently under review." Jessica's face went pale, her expression shifting from shock to a deep sense of fear. I could see the moment when she realized she had underestimated me. She had assumed I was just a harmless, unemployed mother-in-law. Now, she was face to face with the reality of who I really was. I pulled a folder from my bag and began to lay out documents across the table. "Before we discuss anything about the partnership, I think it's essential we talk about one of your employees," I continued, my eyes locking onto Jessica's. Specifically, Jessica's professional conduct. Jessica's hands were trembling as she looked down at the documents now spread across the table. Her face flushed with embarrassment, but I wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. I pointed to the first document. "Here we have an expense report from last March. Jessica claimed this was a client dinner, but according to the reservation records, it was actually her birthday party with friends." I could feel Jessica's panic rising as she opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't done yet. I moved on to the next document. "And here's a hotel stay from last June. Jessica called it a business conference, but if we look closely at her Instagram posts from that same weekend, she was lounging by the pool in a bikini, not attending seminars." The silence in the room was deafening. Mr. Thompson glanced at the documents, his face paling as he began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. One of the other executives, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, leaned forward. "Are you implying that Jessica has been falsifying expense reports?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "I'm not implying anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply presenting the facts, and you can draw your own conclusions. These are discrepancies, and they speak for themselves." Jessica was visibly shaking now, unable to say a word. She had no defense for the evidence I had laid before her, and the truth was slowly sinking in. I could almost feel the tension in the room, as everyone awaited the next move. "Now," I said, closing the folder with a snap, "let's talk about Walsh Enterprises' business needs. We're currently looking for a marketing partner for our expansion into southeastern markets, a contract worth approximately $12 million over 3 years. I let the figure hang in the air for a moment, watching as Mr. Thompson processed the gravity of the situation. $12 million, he repeated faintly, looking between Jessica and me, as if waiting for some kind of explanation. Yes, I said, my voice steady. And Walsh Enterprises has very strict standards when it comes to business ethics. We simply can't afford to work with companies that don't share our values. This is something I hope you understand. Jessica stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous, she shouted, her voice breaking. You can't do this to me over a stupid misunderstanding at a wedding. I looked at her coolly, my gaze unwavering. "A misunderstanding, Jessica," I asked softly. "You humiliated me in front of your boss and your colleagues, then proceeded to brag about it to your mother, your sister, and even someone you called babe. A conversation I'm sure your new husband would love to hear about." Jessica's face went from red to green, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She had played her cards, but now the game had turned in my favor. Mr. Thompson, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat and looked between us, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps we should take a short break," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't think we need a break," I replied, standing up and gathering my things. "I think we're done here. Mr. Thompson, you have some serious decisions to make about your employee and the future of your company's relationship with Walsh Enterprises. I'll be in touch next week to discuss whether or not we'll move forward with this partnership." With that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. I had done what I set out to do. I'd not only exposed Jessica's deceit, but also ensured that Walsh Enterprises would continue its partnership with Thompson and Associates, without Jessica's involvement. As I left the building, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I knew that Jessica would land on her feet, finding another job somewhere that didn't do background checks as thoroughly. But this was more than just about Jessica. It was about standing up for myself, and more importantly, teaching her a lesson she wouldn't forget anytime soon. As I walked out of the office building, the cold drizzle felt refreshing against my skin. I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph, but there was also a part of me that wished it hadn't come to this. No one wants to tear apart their family, especially not in front of a room full of strangers. But sometimes, the truth has a way of pushing you into uncomfortable places, and that's exactly what had happened. When I arrived home later that evening, I found myself sitting on the back patio, sipping my glass of wine and watching the sun dip behind the trees. The world seemed to slow down, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the day. I had taken a stand for myself, and more importantly, I had stood up for the integrity of my family. Michael deserved to know the truth about his wife, no matter how painful it might be. Just as I was lost in my thoughts, my phone buzzed. It was Michael calling, and I could practically feel the panic in his voice before I even answered. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" His voice was strained, and I could hear Jessica's shrill tone in the background. I sighed, taking another sip of wine. "Hello, darling. How was your first day back from the honeymoon?" "Don't hello, darling me," he snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "Jessica came home in tears. She says you got her fired." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't get anyone fired, sweetheart," I replied calmly. "I simply had a business meeting with her employer. A meeting that, if you're honest with yourself, you should have seen coming." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him trying to process everything. "But she said you were vindictive, that you couldn't take a joke at the wedding, and so you used your business connections to ruin her career." I exhaled sharply. This was exactly what I feared. Jessica was still playing the victim, even after everything had been laid bare. "That's her version of the story, Michael. But let me ask you something. Do you think that's the truth? She humiliated me publicly, then bragged about it to her mother, her sister, and even someone she called babe. All I did was make sure she understood the consequences of her actions." I could almost hear Michael's wheels turning. His silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "But Mom, did you really plan all of this? Did you orchestrate the whole thing? Letting her embarrass herself at the wedding, gathering all the information, setting up that meeting with her boss?" His question caught me off guard, and for a split second, I hesitated. Did I plan this entire sequence of events? In a way, yes, I did, but I hadn't orchestrated everything from the beginning. The wedding incident had been the final straw. It had pushed me to take action, but I wanted to give Jessica the chance to come clean on her own. I wanted to see if she would own up to her mistakes. She didn't, and now I had no choice but to take matters into my own hands. I didn't plan for Jessica to call me a loser at the wedding, Michael. I answered slowly, choosing my words carefully. But once she did, yes, I planned my response very carefully. And now she's lost her job, and Thompson and Associates probably won't get the contract. But here's the thing. I didn't destroy her career. She did that herself. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice softer, as if the weight of the situation was settling in. I married someone I don't really know, didn't I? His words hit me harder than I expected. You married someone you thought you knew, Michael. Sometimes that's the same thing, and sometimes it isn't, I said gently. But the real question now is what you're going to do with what you've learned. When the call ended, I felt a pang of sadness for my son. He had been blindsided by someone he loved, someone who had been playing a role all along. I could only hope that this painful lesson would help him see the truth about Jessica, and that he would be strong enough to make the right decisions moving forward. I spent the rest of the evening in silence, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Part of me felt guilty for how things had played out, but another part of me knew that I had done the right thing. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to help them see the truth, even when it hurts. The next morning, I woke up to a sense of calm. I had done what needed to be done, and now it was up to Michael to decide how he wanted to move forward in his marriage. As for Jessica, she would eventually land on her feet. People like her always do. But I hoped that this experience would teach her something about humility and the consequences of her actions. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The game was over, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over my own life again. Days passed, and things began to settle down, but a lingering sense of unease remained in the air. It was as if the dust hadn't fully settled from the whirlwind that had rocked my family. I had done what I felt was necessary to protect my integrity, but the consequences were far-reaching. Michael hadn't yet fully processed everything, and while I could sense the growing tension in him, I knew it was up to him to figure out where he stood with Jessica. It wasn't my place to intervene any further. The next week, I received an unexpected call from Mr. Thompson. "Dorothy," he began, his voice sounding unusually formal, "I wanted to personally thank you for your transparency during our meeting. It's rare that someone takes the time to ensure things are handled with integrity, even when it's difficult. We've decided to move forward with the partnership with Walsh Enterprises." I could feel the satisfaction settling in my chest. Not only had Jessica's unprofessional behavior led to her own downfall, but I had also secured the future of Walsh Enterprises in the process. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Thompson," I replied calmly, but internally, I felt a rush of vindication. "I look forward to working with you and your team." "Of course," he said, but I could tell from his tone that he was still processing everything that had unfolded. I must admit, I was shocked when I learned about Jessica's actions. I'm grateful that you provided the opportunity to clear things up. The conversation ended, and I sat back in my chair, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The fact that I had secured the contract for Walsh Enterprises was a significant achievement, but it wasn't the only thing on my mind. I had been forced to confront a side of Jessica that no one had expected, myself included. It was a difficult truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. Later that day, I called Michael. I had been avoiding the conversation for a while, but now it was time. "Michael, we need to talk," I said gently. "About what?" His voice was quieter than usual, filled with uncertainty. "I know things have been difficult since the wedding," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But I want you to understand something. What happened with Jessica and me wasn't about me getting back at her or punishing her. It was about ensuring that she faced the consequences of her actions, not just for her, but for the sake of your future." There was a long pause before Michael spoke again. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I feel like I've been blind this whole time." His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't want to believe that she could be like this, but the evidence is hard to ignore. Michael, you didn't do anything wrong, I reassured him. You were just in love, and you wanted the best for your wife, but now you need to make your own decisions. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I think it's time for you to look at the situation with clear eyes. You deserve someone who respects you and your family. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice sounded firmer, more resolved. I know you're right, Mom. I've been in denial. I don't know what's going to happen with Jessica, but I do know that I need to be honest with myself. I need to figure out what I want moving forward. I smiled softly, proud of him for coming to that realization. I'm always here for you, Michael. Whatever happens, you have my support. After the call ended, I felt a sense of relief. Michael was finally starting to see things for what they were. And while it would be painful, it was the only way forward. As for Jessica, I knew she would eventually find another job, but the damage had been done. Her inflated sense of self-importance had led her to underestimate the people around her, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The following weeks were quieter. Michael took some time to think things over, and although he and Jessica had not yet made any decisions, the distance between them had started to grow. I didn't press him for answers, but I could see that he was struggling with what had happened. He loved her, but he was also starting to realize that love alone wasn't enough to make a marriage work. As for me, I focused on moving forward. Walsh Enterprises was now in a strong position to expand, and I was determined to make sure everything went smoothly. The partnership with Thompson and Associates would bring in much-needed business, and I was prepared to work hard to ensure its success. But despite my professional success, there was still something gnawing at me. I had done what I believed was necessary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of me had changed forever. I had been forced to confront the harsh truths of my family and my life, and while it had been painful, I knew it was the right thing to do. In the end, I had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself and your values meant making difficult choices. It meant showing people, even those you love, that you wouldn't allow yourself to be pushed around. And while the road ahead might be uncertain, I knew that I had the strength to face whatever came next. Time passed, and as weeks turned into months, the fallout from the wedding incident began to settle into the background, though the lessons from that day still lingered in my mind. Michael had, as expected, begun to distance himself from Jessica. It wasn't an easy process for him, but I could see the clarity growing in his eyes. He wasn't the same person who had married her so blindly, and that gave me hope that he would make the right choices for himself in the future. But even as Michael struggled with his own emotions, I had my own life to rebuild. While I'd secured the partnership with Thompson and Associates, I knew I couldn't afford to rest on my laurels. Walsh Enterprises was growing, and with the new contract, I was determined to ensure that our expansion into southeastern markets was as successful as possible. I spent countless hours reviewing every aspect of the company, making sure the foundation we had built was solid enough to support the new business. It wasn't just about numbers or contracts. It was about maintaining the integrity that had made Walsh Enterprises what it was. I knew Jessica's betrayal had shaken me more than I let on, but it had also pushed me to double down on my own values. I couldn't let anyone think that my success was a fluke. I had earned every step of my career, and I was ready to prove it again. And then came the unexpected. A few months after the wedding, I received a call from Michael. His voice was a little different this time, calmer, more resolute. "Mom," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about Jessica, about the wedding, and about what I want for my future." I felt a tightness in my chest. I knew this conversation was coming, but hearing it from him still made my heart ache. "And what have you decided?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'm going to file for divorce," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I've realized that Jessica isn't who I thought she was. She's not the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. and while I'll always care about her, I can't ignore the truth anymore. I let out a quiet breath of relief. It wasn't that I didn't care about Jessica, she was still family after all, but seeing my son make this decision for himself, based on the truth, was a victory in its own right. "I'm proud of you, Michael," I said softly. "This isn't easy, but you've taken control of your own life. I'll be here for you every step of the way." His voice cracked slightly as he replied, "I know, Mom. I'm ready for this next chapter, and I'm ready to rebuild my life. I'm just glad I have you to support me." That was all I needed to hear. My son had made it through one of the hardest decisions of his life, and now he was free to build a future that was true to who he was. And as for me, I felt a new sense of purpose. The past few months had been filled with uncertainty and challenges, but they had also given me clarity and strength. I was no longer the woman who had allowed herself to be humiliated or manipulated. I was Dorothy Walsh, CEO of Walsh Enterprises, and I had built this life on my own terms. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I focused on my company, my family, and myself. I took time for reflection and also for growth, making sure that I didn't lose sight of the lessons I had learned. Jessica's actions had been hurtful, but they had also been a catalyst for change. I knew now that I would never again allow myself to be diminished by anyone, no matter how close they were to me. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing reports, I looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I had worked so hard to get here. There had been obstacles, betrayals, and heartache along the way, but I had come out stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And just as I was about to turn back to my work, my phone rang. It was Michael. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice warm and filled with newfound confidence. "I wanted to tell you something. I met someone. She's different, and I think this time I'm getting it right." My heart swelled with pride. "I'm so happy for you, Michael," I replied. "You deserve someone who truly understands you and respects you." "I think I've found her, Mom," he said with a smile in his voice, "and I'm excited to see where this goes." As I hung up the phone, I smiled to myself. Life had a funny way of working out. Sometimes it took hitting rock bottom to realize just how strong you truly are. And now, Michael had his own chance at happiness, just as I had mine. We had both learned from our experiences, and we were ready to move forward. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. I had my family, my business, and most importantly, I had myself. And with that, I was ready to face whatever came next. Weeks passed, and life started to return to a new normal. Michael's divorce proceedings with Jessica were moving forward, and though it was difficult for him, I could sense a growing relief in his voice with each conversation. It was as though he had lifted a heavy weight off his shoulders, and I could only hope that he would find peace in the next chapter of his life. As for me, I had been busy focusing on growing Walsh Enterprises, working hard to secure more contracts, and solidify our reputation in the southeastern market. But even as I buried myself in my work, a nagging feeling of unfinished business lingered in the back of my mind. While Jessica's actions had shaken me to my core, and her betrayal was painful, I knew that there was one final piece of the puzzle left to address. Despite everything that had transpired, I couldn't help but feel that I still hadn't fully resolved the issue with her. Yes, she had humiliated me, but I needed to be sure that I was leaving no loose ends. I couldn't let her get away with thinking that what she had done was without consequence. One late afternoon, as I sat at my desk reviewing contracts, the phone rang. It was an unexpected number, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Jessica. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky, though I could detect a hint of desperation beneath it. For a moment, I was taken aback. I hadn't spoken to her since the wedding debacle, and part of me wondered what she could possibly have to say to me now. I was ready to hang up, but something inside me told me to listen. "What do you need, Jessica?" I asked, my tone cautious but composed. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've hurt you and Michael. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to make things right. I just wanted to apologize for everything," she said, the words coming out in a rush, as though she had practiced them 1,000 times, but was still uncertain of how they would be received. I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. Apologies were easy to offer when someone was backed into a corner, but the truth was that I wasn't sure whether I was ready to forgive her. "Jessica, I appreciate that you're acknowledging what you've done, but an apology doesn't erase the damage that's been done to my family, or to me. It doesn't change the fact that you tried to publicly humiliate me." "I know," she replied softly. "I was wrong. I let my insecurities and ambition blind me to what really mattered, and I lost sight of the person I wanted to be. I can't change what happened, but I can work to be better, to fix things." Her words were heavy with regret, but I could tell they were coming from a place of genuine reflection. For a moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy for her. She was just as much a victim of her own pride and ambition as anyone else. But sympathy was not the same as forgiveness. "I hear you, Jessica," I said, my voice steady. "But just know that there are consequences for our actions, and sometimes those consequences are irreversible." There was silence on the other end for a long moment, and I could tell she was processing my words. Finally, she spoke again, this time more quietly. "I understand, and I know I've lost your trust. I can't undo that. But I hope one day we can find a way to move past this, for Michael's sake, if nothing else." I felt a pang in my chest at the mention of Michael. I had spent so much time protecting him, ensuring his happiness, that I had almost forgotten the most important thing, his ability to make his own decisions. He would have to choose his own path now, and it was up to him to decide whether Jessica was a part of that future. But for me, I knew that the door to reconciliation with her was, at least for now, closed. "I think that's enough for now, Jessica," I said, my voice softer than before. "You've said your piece, and I've said mine. The rest is up to you." She thanked me before hanging up, and I sat in silence for a long time after the call ended. Part of me wanted to be angry, to continue holding on to the bitterness of what she had done. But another part of me realized that forgiveness was a gift I was giving to myself, not to her. I had lived my life for so long with the weight of other people's actions pressing down on me, but now I understood that letting go of that weight was the only way forward. The next morning, I felt a shift within myself. I wasn't completely free from the shadows of the past, but I had learned to let go of the things that no longer served me. Jessica had apologized, but I had done the work of healing myself. I wasn't going to let her actions define me anymore. I was Dorothy Walsh, and I would continue to rise above whatever came my way. Weeks later, I received an update about Jessica. She had found a new job, though not in a field that would make her famous. It seemed as though she had been humbled by the events that had unfolded, and for that, I felt a small sense of peace. I had helped her face the consequences of her actions, and now she would have to rebuild her life, just as I had rebuilt mine. I never spoke to her again after that phone call, but I had moved on, and so had Michael. He began dating someone new, someone who treated him with kindness and respect. It wasn't an easy road for him, but he was finding his way, just as I had found mine. Life had a way of working out, even in the most unexpected ways. As I sat at my desk that day, reflecting on how far I had come, I realized that the hardest battles often lead to the most rewarding victories. And as for Jessica, well, I wished her well. But my focus now was on the future I had built for myself and for my family.